Okay, AP Psych class, we are now in part 4 of Unit 9 concerning the development of children. We're going to talk specifically about gender development and gender roles. So if we look at gender development there, I always think that that's a fun visual there. What would a real woman look like with Barbie's proportions? Not very pretty in my opinion. But anyways, we'll get to that in due time. If we take a look at the definition of gender, a gender is the biological and socially influenced characteristics by which people define male or female as our gender. Okay, this often aligns with an individual's sex, like concerning the reproductive parts that you were born with, but not always. Like when we talk about in our unit on like counseling and therapies and things, we can talk about gender identity issues that people may seek therapy or advice on, and we'll debate whether or not we feel that those should be disorders listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So that's all coming up later, but gender and sex are often synonyms, but they technically don't have to be. Okay, so it would be foolish of us to not acknowledge that there are some differences amongst male versus females, right? But there are some similarities too. Concerning aggression, right, the physical or verbal behavior that's intended to hurt someone, studies worldwide will look at aggression gender gap and see that it tends to be labeled as a more male characteristic in most cultures. However, this gender gap tends to pertain to physical rather than verbal aggression, and so to just say that aggression is only a male thing might not be taking studies of verbal aggression into consideration. Social power, right? We could talk about the similarities and differences there. Concerning that, men are perceived as being more dominant, forceful, and independent, right? As leaders, they tend to be more directive. Women tend to be more democratic concerning their decision making if they're in a position of authority. And I guess women can also be perceived being more deferential and more of a nurturing role and an affiliative role than necessarily a leadership role. And again, whether that's right or wrong, those perceptions of differences seem to occur worldwide. Carol Gilligan, a psychologist that we'll talk a lot more about in the adolescent development section, just said that women are more concerned than men in making connections with others. So concerning social connectedness, that tends to be a female thing more so than a male. And the differences are noticeable in how children play, right? Girls play in groups that are smaller and less competitive in most situations. Because they are more interdependent, women are likely to use conversation to explore relationships, while men are likely to use conversation to communicate solutions to issues. And so there are some different things. Women tend to tend and befriend, right? They'll turn to others for support, especially when coping with stress, whereas male gender is more likely to internalize that. And these gender differences in power, the connectedness, peak in late adolescence and early adulthood. But by age 50, these differences seem to have decreased. So it's only through like adolescence, early and middle adulthood that these differences are, I guess, glaring. Okay, so when we talk about the nature and nurture of gender development, all right, the 23rd pair of chromosomes determines the developing person's sex, right? And remember that the mother always contributes the X chromosome and the father contributes the Y chromosome. That in about the 7th week, this hormone initiates the development of external male sex organs. And so when that Y chromosome is there, it's the Y chromosome that begins to produce testosterone and to make a male, like a child, be of the male sex. So these sex hormones, we know, or the sex chromosomes, are going to control hormones that influence the brain's wiring, which is fascinating, right? So in adulthood, part of the frontal lobe, which we know is involved in verbal fluency, is thicker in women. And that could explain that correlation that we have, like concerning maturation and development, that language acquisition is often later to develop in male children than female children. It could just be a result of hormones' effects on brain wiring during development. Part of the brain's parietal cortex, which is key for spatial perception, is thicker in men, and so spatial relationships, drafting, engineering. I'm trying to think of other, or architecture, right? Other fields that tend to be male dominated. I mean, perhaps this is a result of a thicker parietal cortex concerning spatial perception. Who knows? It could be a potential reason. Okay, but there is, despite the physical differences or reasons, there are still social constructions and gender roles. Again, these seem to become less rigidly fixed as we progress through time. But our expectations about like what men and women should do or ways they should behave would define our culture's gender roles. They're not rigidly fixed by evolution, as evidenced by the fact that they vary across cultures and they vary over time. Okay, so like nomadic cultures, when anthropologists study them, there tends to be minimal division of labor by sex. But by contrast, agricultural societies, it tends to be that the woman remains close to the home while men roam freely, like herding sheep or cultivating the land. And so they don't necessarily need to be based on some sort of evolutionary perspective. They're purely cultural. So our individual sense of being male or female is what we would call our gender identity. And there's a lot of questions, especially, concerning gender identity questions, gender identity issues, like there's always this question of like, well, is it a result of parenting? Is it a result of genetics? So our individual sense of being male or female is called our gender identity. And the degree to which we exhibit those traits is called gender typing. Okay, and so there is some evidence that this is a result of social learning. For example, children learn gender-linked behaviors by observing and imitating others. And so even in a home where traditional gender typing is discouraged, kids are still going to pick up on boy things versus girl things. Fascinating conversation with Charlotte the other day as we were organizing the Fisher-Price Little People into male versus female. And I kept asking her, well, how do you know this is a boy? Or how do you know this is a girl? And she kept telling me things like, well, this one has eyelashes, or this one's wearing pink. And I just kept saying, boy, I didn't think that I ever emphasized that kind of stuff. How in the world does she know this? It's just from experiencing, our culture and society. But they also probably learned from that development of what Piaget said were schemas, right? And so they adjust their behavior accordingly, which would, say that, cognition or thinking probably plays a role in gender identity too. Okay? So, but concerning gender identity issues, most individuals that are, experiencing a gender identity issue, like, transgender issue, probably say that they felt like, similar to the things that we discussed concerning sexual orientation, that they just felt as if they were born into the wrong body their whole lives. And so, trying to explore like where that, if that wasn't socially constructed, then where does that generate, biologically speaking, is something fascinating that is, being explored by psychologists and neuroscientists alike. Okay. Concerning development, what role do parents and peers play in your development? Whether we're talking about cognitive, social, or gender roles. Environmental influences begin, as early as prenatal development, right? Like technically the womb was the first environment that you lived in. But early experience, we know from good old 40 studies. Remember crowding the behavioral sink? Remember Rosenwig and Crutch's research on rats that were raised in enriched environments had thicker brain cortexes than animals raised in isolation. And so we know that the neural development is rapid in those early years. So what are you doing with them? Are you giving them experiences that allow them to, exercise the neurons, make neural connections, form synaptic connections between these neurons? If not, pruning's going to happen and it's all going to go bye-bye. So we know that plays a role. And think back to 40 studies, okay? That pruning by puberty means that we lose out if we don't take advantage of those early experiences. So do parents get the credit for smart kids? Well, I guess if we, stay tuned for the next unit when we talk about intelligence and the heritability of intelligence. But, we got a lot of this from that Freudian view of psychiatry, right? That parents, shape their kids' futures, that you can do something to a kid and mess them up forever. And parents honestly do influence some areas of our lives. Usually your political attitudes, your personal manners, your religious beliefs are usually pretty closely aligned to how you were raised to be. And we know that personality tends to be more of a nature thing, and that environmental similarities on the home front probably account for less than 10% of the differences we see in like siblings and their personality. So we know that personality and temperament, there's a lot to be said about the genetic connection of those, and that parents do influence you concerning, certain belief systems. But the thing that is really big to know, especially concerning adolescent development, is the influence of peers. Your siblings, I think that we could say, are probably your first peer group, provided that you are relatively close in age to your siblings. Like if you have a sibling that's like 15 years older than you, then probably not. But peers have a pretty powerful effect, and I would argue that siblings can fall into that as well. It's kind of a result of, how you select them. So since your siblings were probably raised in the same environment, you tend to align a lot on beliefs and attitudes. And then when you go out into the world of school and start selecting friends, you probably seek out others with similar attitudes and interests, right? And so, peers tend to be just as important in the development of your attitudes and your manners and your beliefs as do your parents. And so I guess you don't like to hear this as young people, but, parents have every right to be, questioning, who their kids are friends with, since we know that peer influence is pretty important. And we'll explore that one a lot more in our next video, part 5, when we get into adolescent development. So bring any questions you have about gender identity and gender development and parents and peers with you to class. Thanks for listening.